The political philosophy referred to as traditionalism is, like all ideological doctrines, misunderstood to one degree or another. However, the general perception people have of what it means to be a traditionalist is to be somebody who adheres to or practices traditional values, what has historically been respected by past cultures, no longer in motion. An individual who wishes to preserve values, customs, and the human spirit of the old days. The question worth asking is, when was modernity? Depending on who you ask based upon their political beliefs, you'll receive different answers. People might tell you modernity started 60 or so years ago, in the 1960s and 50s. Some may say modernity was the birth of Christ, thus marking the entrance of Christianity onto the globe, in itself constituted a leap forward in modernity. What makes the modern world is disputed by different thinkers, including historians and self-identified traditionalist writers. However, the most common answer, the most agreed upon premise for when modernity began, was the European Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment is said to have started around the beginning of the 18th century, but I don't believe it had any real effect until after the French Revolution. The revolution lasted from 1789 to 1799. 10 years, 6 months, and 4 days. It was the absolute actualization of what the Enlightenment thinkers all collectively advocated, the overthrow of the absolute monarchy which ruled over France with an iron throne, and to replace it with a representative democracy. Even though John Locke, often considered the founding father of liberalism, was alive and well far before the French Revolutionary period, his ideas weren't put into practice until this later date. It was the establishment of what liberalism aimed to construct: secular, constitutional republics. Marxism and fascism were to follow in the wake of liberalism, Marxism claiming the 19th century, and fascism the first half of the 20th century. The late 18th century, however, was indeed the century of liberalism. What had occurred in France was only a stepping stone to what would later occur, with just the immense amount of influence the French Revolution had generated. If one were to look throughout history and examine how much has happened since the beginning of existence, practically nothing would be worth taking note of prior to the French Revolution. Or, at least, this is how liberal academics see it. The series of events which followed were so dramatic, so much happening. It appears, in history books, the world was silent prior to the Enlightenment. It's no coincidence that around the time of the French Revolutionary period, industrial capitalism was crawling throughout the European continent, having been developed with the expansion of steel, iron, and industry, that shifted the primary means of production from the agricultural sphere, where most labor was carried out with simple gardening and farming tools, to the industrial sphere. Factories, workshops, mines, and construction sites were being built by the sweat of wage laborers, employed by a new ruling class called the bourgeoisie. A capitalist would have dozens to hundreds to thousands of workers, laboring away for the sake of their profits, extracting the vast majority of the wealth they produced, allowing it to be concentrated into the hands of a small, few private owners of production. Self-employment drastically decreased, with more workers being forced into urban servitude. With the existence of capitalism as the main mode of production, seeing capitalist exploitation only existed in the form of chattel slavery prior to this point in history. Liberalism was able to claim this as their own invention of ideology. Thus, liberalism became associated with pro-capitalist, pro-market views, as opposed to the early communism that was developed in revolutionary France, by thinkers such as Joseph Alexandre Victor de Happe, for example, the person known for coining the word communism. De Happe himself was very much inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment, and thought that if everyone lived in a soft, soothing, philosophical community, a commune where everything was held in common, there wouldn't be the stress, anxiety, and depression running rampant in modern societies. And he was right. People who lived communally, where there exists no private property, and everything belongs to all in common, tend to live very happy lives, especially with the large emphasis on community, and the development of everyone's internal and physical well-being. Philosophers such as de Happe, Gabriel Bonnet de Maple, Etienne Gabriel Morelli, Gracchus Babe, Sylvain Michel, and many more, are often forgotten despite having left an immensely important impact during their life. Because they were theoretical communists, predating individuals like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels who actually advocated the equal pulling together of all resources for the common folk to enjoy, the abolition of the market economy, they were cast aside by the mainstream elites. It was the liberal capitalists, not the communists inspired by liberal ideas, that Western society embraced and upheld as role models, as thinkers to aspire to. As a long-time believer in the concept of a multiverse, let's say there exists two separate timelines of liberalism. One timeline is the timeline we're already familiar with, nothing special. Quite boring, actually. It's the reality we currently exist within, where liberal capitalism has dominated the entire industrialized world, with the more agricultural areas of the globe acting more traditionalist and having mostly evenly split wealth for the productivity they maintain. This timeline has the alignment, the age of rationalism, materialism, positivism, republicanism, parliamentarianism, and private property that went on to strengthen the political appeals to markets and capitalism, where the best people know of communism only exists within the framework of what is referred to as Marxism. It was the age of liberating women, the age of granting natural rights, the age of theorists who formulated ideas of democracy, internationalism, and equality, except for in regards to economics. And a lot of that, to me, is good, minus the private property part. Of course, it was a good thing, a great thing that women received their rights, that they weren't the slaves of men. It was a horrible thing, patriarchy, both historically and in the present age. We can look to many countries today which have horrific treatment of women. I don't think anyone on the right should celebrate the stripping away of people's rights. That's just gross. Now let's try to imagine an alternative timeline, another dimension, where it was the philosophy of the communists that went on to constructing new societies. Today, if it were as popular as capitalist liberalism, we'd be living, thriving, in stateless, classless, moneyless paradises, borderless autonomous territories that are comprised of individual philosophical communities of people. Imagine a world without currency, without markets, without buying and selling, absent of all financial exchange. You can just picture the level of sheer individualism that would be achieved through a communist system. Nobody would have to pay for anything, and could instead access all means of production and means of consumption, whenever they wanted to, since all productive and personal possessions are held in common. Whenever something is produced, it's stored in an open space for anyone to partake in. Work would truly be voluntary, where labor exists as a means of expressing oneself, of enjoying one's work, as opposed to something which is forced due to the drive for obtaining private property. People would be able to travel anywhere, live anywhere, because transportation and houses aren't privatized, nor are you owned by anyone. Since everything is held in common, that means self-ownership has become universal, because everyone owns themselves. This is the basis of common ownership applied to human beings and animals. Nothing is possessed, it just exists. And without borders, because nations are no longer existent, since they're based upon the private ownership of land, thus the ability to exclude its content from others, all individuals are free to travel whenever they want, wherever they want. So, even with nations out of the way, a byproduct of this individualism is its organic association with collectivism. Because people have the natural right to freedom of association, because they have themselves, they own themselves, and aren't owned as the private property of anyone else, they're allowed to form their own philosophical communities. These spaces could be as big as communes, a few dozen to hundreds of people, or they could be entire cities, urbanized spaces where goods and services are distributed according to needs, not payment. Now, what's really interesting about this social organization of humanity, this structure of social relations as a production of different economic climates, is that people of different races and ethnic groups are permitted to voluntarily associate exclusively with those of their own ancestral type, to the exclusion of all others. Because there are no nations, freedom of movement is always allowed between whichever area one finds themselves in the moment, and where they wish to travel to in the future. Because there exists no privatization of land, there will naturally exist permanent autonomous zones, territories without borders where outsiders are democratically kept out, and expelled when entering into their spaces by decentralized communities. See, without a state to force people to associate with one another against their will, entirely consensual communities and societies will form, organize, and formulate across different geographical planes. There will exist communities comprised entirely of hippies, transsexuals, people who like Pokemon, whatever voluntary associations wish to exist, and of course, racially and ethnically homogeneous spaces, where people of a certain ancestry live and thrive with their own kind. Their bond is strengthened through a reflection of their economic tendencies, the gift economies they have, where instead of buying and selling, everything is given as a gift, where all property is held in common by a community, so they can raise one another to health, vigor, and energy. You see, National Anarchism, the term nation referring to stock, kind, species, race of people, tribe, not sovereign country, was a school of anarchist thought created by individuals who understood the obvious political implications surrounding a world without states, without capitalists, without any sort of rulers or authority. Because there exists no nations, no states, and no capitalists, which is what anarchism seeks to achieve, there's going to be nobody preventing freedom of association, and thus the structuring of societies with the rules, cultures, demographics, and environments a lot of people on the far right desire. So, national anarchist communities made up of people of a certain folk, whichever demographic or set of demographics one wishes to inhabit a certain autonomous territory. It tends to be that these communities naturally formed based upon racial, ethnic, religious, cultural, and ideological homogeny. This is because we all desire, crave, to be with others most similar to us, of our own kind. See, the reason Marxism overtook orthodox communism, or as I like to call it, real communism, and went on to calling itself communism was not because Marx had some sinister plan to destroy what pre-Marxist communists had theorized, even though there were many, especially during the height of history that was revolutionary France. It was just an unfortunate fact that Vladimir Lenin and many other Marxist-Leninist ideologues had taken hold of Karl Marx's ideas as opposed to anarchist ideas espoused by people such as Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Peter Kropotkin, or Carlo Cafiero. Unlike the French revolutionary communists who advocated the common ownership of all property, regardless of its classification, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and by extension the broader socialist movement by this point, were concerned only with the common ownership of productive property, things that, through labor, create more things. In other words, items of production, not consumption. Because of this, communism became indistinguishable from market socialism, and the oldest of far-left ideas advocated by the more radical factions within the French Revolution, though certainly dating back to ancient Greece where we can accurately say communism was first advanced in ink and paper, had, well, faded into nothingness. Hence, this is why communism in today's world exists only in name, not in any theoretical substance. If you have trouble believing this, I presume that people watching my videos are to the far right of the political spectrum, so you likely don't interact with many leftists, though I've certainly had the long time experience of doing so. Ask yourself, when was the last time you heard a leftist advocate for the common ownership of all property? As an interesting fact, when I had my now deleted leftist channel, when I made anarchist and communist content, I remember actually advocating a gift economy to overtake a market one. Hilariously, this got me some pushback from a few people on the left who said they were communists, even anarchist communists, but clearly weren't. They wanted markets, they wanted buying and selling. What they didn't want was the common enjoyment of the fruits of this earth. And because of this, communism has long been dead. Killed by a combination of Marxism and American anti-socialism. Left dead in its grave, and without revival. Nobody even appears to want to revive it. Which is the most depressing thing about this whole historical situation. The most you'll find in advocacy of communism is a few books written on anthropology, which talk about gift economies that existed prior to the takeover by markets. Very good, they're very good books by the way, but don't actually advocate a communist economy, just provide historical accounts of communism's existence in practice. So if communism is a deceased ideology, why do so many deranged weirdos on the right, including fascists, pretend it isn't, that it's alive and well and kicking, and leftists are advocating it? Well, because they're idiots of course, but no more idiotic than the leftists who aren't in fact advocating communism. The term exists only in name now, and nothing more. It is beyond unfortunate, but it's something I've decided I'm not going to let slip by me. No matter how hard it appears to revive, I have some faith that perhaps just one day people will quit their autistic screeching and actually attempt to dig into the meaning of this philosophy to look past its non-adaptations. I do presume, however, that even without sinister intent from Marxists and contemporary leftists, including those of the intersectional variety, there was, and still is today, a deliberate sabotage of communist ideology by a certain group of ideologues. I'm talking about liberals, by the way. It was bourgeois liberalism itself as a defender of freedom and liberty, which permitted the finger to be pointed at what it thought was communism, which was really just Marxism, and say that capitalism was the real distillation of individualism. It was the alignment that was hijacked by the ideological capitalists, by supporters of the wage enslavement system and the privatization of goods and services, who spun the French Revolution in the direction of representative democracy and capitalism, as opposed to alternative systems supported by the theoretical communists, participatory democracy and the gift economy. It's the left liberals, or social liberals as they're sometimes called, don't appear to understand that in order to have real freedom, genuine, non-contradictory individualism, you have to eliminate private property. Whenever something undergoes privatization, it loses its accessibility to the community as a whole, and is instead reserved only for one or a few people, to the exclusion of all the rest. And with this, you can see the widespread death caused by the private property system. Water privatization alone causes 5 million deaths per year. And this isn't even getting into food privatization, the private ownership of medicine, of housing, and the fatalities caused through pollution caused, and only allowed to be caused, through private companies and their destruction of natural environments. It's really just a disgusting disrespect for human and animal life, for forests, for nature, and for the concept of decency and morality altogether. The intersectional anarchists and communists who think their economic and political systems, if ever implemented, and I sincerely hope that they are implemented, will lead to social progressivism, however that is defined, have fooled themselves into believing that with this equalization of humanity, on a systematic and legal level, people will suddenly recognize different demographics as equivalent in all or most fields. And this simply isn't true. People are always going to branch off into their own societies, where their guilds are based upon homogeny. It's not only nature to want to be of one's own kind, it's destiny. It is an expression of health, of vitality, of passion, to have an in-group. And not just this, but to display that organic sensibility of ethnocentralism. That, too, is a sign of a happy, full of life individual. One might notice that traditionalism and racial separatism aren't inherently authoritarian, but they don't require wielding any power over others, or making the world unequal in any manner. They can be authoritarian, and I very much prefer them not to be. The political right are in constant advocacy of authoritarianism, these authoritarian means to achieve their goals, their social orders. But look around you, rightists. You haven't got your society. Racial separatism only violates people's rights when it involves nationalism, or expelling any population from a pre-established homeland. As opposed to creating new communities, which national anarchism asserts as vital, the white nationalist movement has instead made an absolute joke out of itself. Parliamentary politics, the electoral system, will never ever vote in a white nationalist candidate. As long as you work within the system and not around it, you'll never get your ethno-state. And there is not near enough racial consciousness to start a white nationalist revolution. Not anywhere near enough people are going to sacrifice their lives for the sake of getting rid of people of color, which is already a terrible thing to do, by the way. I don't want to expel anyone. I just want space for my lovely race. This applies to all racial and ethnic groups. And even here, it's the Europeans I care about that I want to live with, not just any Europeans. We're naturally selective even within specific selections of people. Tradition, too, is not authoritarian, but can be enforced upon people, if individuals aren't free to choose how they live. Modernity, likewise, is the same. It's forced upon us today. We don't have the choice to live in the sort of societies we want to. Panarchism advocates the natural right for everyone to live in whichever social order, under any government or stateless territories they see fit. But unfortunately, nobody espouses the virtues of panarchy in the modern world, or really ever in history. Just like genuine communism, it too is non-existent. You can tell that people such as myself are pretty much fucked. There's nothing that can be done to help the public in the context of guiding them to a correct, positive faith, a political orientation that grants freedom while preserving tradition. This is why I don't do the whole left-wing, right-wing puppet show. It's just a display of two factions, which are under the impression they'll somehow get their will, but will end up destroying the earth in the process due to the amount of war they'll create. The absence of racial separation where there exists ancestral diversity is, in its current implementation, immensely totalitarian. This is because it's forced upon people, since they can't choose where they want to live. and the privatization of housing, transportation, and travel to other territories, including the private property concept known as countries, makes this all the more difficult to escape diversity. So, as we can see with the Enlightenment, this was the entrance into modernity. Just that the French Revolution itself wasn't a production of modernist thought, but that it led to political modernism. The consequences of the French Revolution, the aftermath, not the events of the revolution itself, are what I'm, and traditionalists in general, are against. What traditionalism combats is the modern world that's become corrupted by consumerism, capitalism, the commodification of love and marriage, the destruction of cultural architecture in replacement for modernist filth. The swarms of diversity we're forced to live under, the out-of-control drug crisis, only made worse by the misguided war on drugs and Western states devoid of identity, heritage, culture, and spirit. Nobody feels connected, which is the biggest concern of traditionalists and identitarians. They want people to have an identity, that be of a national, racial, ethnic, cultural, religious, spiritual, ideological, or historical identity. It is the group they're concerned with, not merely individuals within such a group. What defines the political right, the true traditionalist right, is its historical appeal to the collective, to the Volk, a people characterized by their homogeny, customs, and love for one another. What liberalism did was claim that with enlightenment, with rationalistic positivism and a rejection of pseudoscience and what it refers to as racism, humanity in its entirety will be uplifted, just automatically, that no further work will need to be done in order to secure a happy, fulfilling existence for the world's billions of inhabitants. It pretends there exists this universal man-woman, but there isn't a sweeping, insane variety of different people, individuals and collectives, who have different interests, different goals, and alternative means of living and sustaining themselves. Liberalism says that if we adopt this universalist identity, something which transcends race, spirituality, and cultural associations, we'll all act as one. However, despite looking at humanity as one, it's in no way collectivist. That's because it doesn't care about collectives, it cares about one collective only, just the human species without anything extra attached to it. It stares at the globe with this twisted smile liberalism, and says if we've already achieved a perfect utopia, that no extra work needs to be done. In a sense, liberalism despises change, alteration from established, socially acceptable normalities. It doesn't desire to make things different, instead to keep them the same. It's reactionary in a way because it hates genuine progress, because it utilizes a cruel statism. Liberal nation-states maintain all that's rooted in injustice, all that's decadent and out of character for traditional peoples, forcing workers into servitude to fulfill the financial wills of their bosses, long hours, bad working environments for miserable wages in return. It keeps them utterly enslaved, without any say of how their field of labor should ideally be run. It's the distillation of everything wrong with political hierarchicalism, and yet, while entirely disrespecting equality and liberty, substituting it for hierarchy and authority, it fucking somehow still manages to preach tolerance, peace, harmony, whatever it says it's for. It claims that by forcing people of different races and ethnicities to interact and involve themselves with one another, even if they don't want to, even if this leads to widespread struggle and fucking race wars, true egalitarianism can still subsist. Even if this leads to extreme gentrification, which harms people of all races by impoverishing large quantities of people whenever a wealthier class moves into an area, even if it causes the degeneracy known as miscegenation, eroding newborn children of any healthy identity and thus, ironically, destroying real diversity, apparently this is all just fine and dandy. It would be inaccurate to say we live under a right-wing or left-wing set of states currently across the liberalizing West. Neoliberalism and social liberalism have become the dominant expressions of politics almost everywhere we go, to the point where we don't even notice the political culture that's developed around us, because from birth we're exposed to social environments constructed upon liberalistic principles. It's just ingrained into our minds. The fact that we witness now, what we witness, it must be normal, must be justified. But if we think critically, bother to question what's placed in front of us, we'll find that, well, no, it's not okay to force diversity, modernity, and multiculturalism upon people. And it's also not okay in the slightest to allow wage labor, to have proletarians forced to work away their lives for the sake of bourgeois elites. And you know, these elites are disproportionately kikes, right? Liberalism is sort of a defense of bourgeois Semitism the way I view it. No wonder the institutions capitalists own privately push socially progressive agendas, because they produce the most money off of it. and you don't have an ethical conscience to say no. But at the same time, my denouncement of what's here being referred to as social progressivism doesn't mean I'm not, in many ways, mostly even, socially progressive myself. For instance, I don't believe men or women are inferior or superior to one another. I believe they're equal and should be treated equally given the same rights. I don't have a problem with transgender or gay people in their inherent nature. But at the same time, again, because I'm a supporter of liberty, I recognize that many on the political right do have a problem with faggotry, and so, in their National Anarchist communities, they have the full right to exclude them from inhabiting their spaces. Because trans and gay individuals will still have their own voluntary associations, which are equal to all others, there's no problem here. Everyone has the right and should have the choice to live with others who conform to their ideal image of what their community should look like. French revolutionary liberalism had its historical place, not so much in the ideas of the American founding fathers, but in the heart of pre-modernist France. I can understand and I support the overthrow of any oppressive form of government, such as absolute monarchy. This is where me and the right fundamentally disagree, it seems, in our treatment of authority. Hence, why I'm not a fascist or anyone on the political right. At the same time, two things should be noted. I would have obviously replaced the monarchy with a participative democracy, not a representative one, which in my opinion just constitutes electoral dictatorship. And secondly, if you want to have certain rules in their communities, that being social orders without rulers, but with democratically decided laws nonetheless, I'm completely fine with whatever they wish to implement. If it's all consensual and all members of a community have the right to opt out whenever they please, who am I to oppose it? I can critique the rules in question, but never dismantle them. To be free means the right to sacrifice one's freedom if done voluntarily. So, fascists can still construct societies with the laws they want, just without any centralized institutions or monopoly on force, which of course makes such societies other than fascist, they're voluntarist, anarchist. But they still achieve the goals of what fascism sought to manufacture through violence and authority, which I suppose seemed pretty cool at the time, but didn't work out too well for all the people trapped under their oppressive regimes. A national anarchist society can be incredibly strict, orderly, paternalistic, and prohibiting of many actions. As long as people are free to leave it for a different anarchist society, then zero intervention should occur. And honestly, I prefer a pretty strict, order-focused society, one where the rules are obeyed not out of fear, but because a moral consciousness is implanted in the individuals, because they don't want to do immoral things or do things that are bad for themselves. They're self-regulating. Coming back to what it means for someone to identify as a traditionalist, it means they're opposed to contemporary liberalism in all its forms, including its immensely cursed offspring, which considers itself to be on the right, conservatism. Now I don't really know what conservatism means to conservatives, since I can't recall any one of them ever defining it, but I believe the conservatives, perceive themselves as upholding tradition, or at least opposing social liberalism / left liberalism. Although, if they're opposed to left liberalism, then what are their distinguishing features? Aside from conservatives, aka right-wing liberals, being more insufferable personally, they tend to be more supportive of free markets, capitalist tyranny, and freedom of speech. Now, the free speech stuff is cool and all, but their endorsement of the worship of proletarian poverty for the sake of enriching a few evil parasites who leech off of the productive labor of everyone else isn't so exciting. Today, aside from capitalism, all I know conservatives to be, for those who identify as such, is in their opposition to political correctness, but not even consistently. Many of them still endorse the stigmatization of racial separatist beliefs, and often take utterly brain-damaged shots at fascism and National Socialism. Now, the notion that markets and capitalism are, even in the most microscopic quantity, compatible with freedom and individualism, doesn't need nor deserve a refutation. Fuck off. Conservatives are autistic, overgrown children for even suggesting industrial slavery could possibly be liberating. Many right liberals like to paint fascism as being on the political left due to its obsession with state authority, even though, within the conservative framework of politics, one needs to utilize state authority in order to list businesses from having their means of production seized by workers, by syndicalist organizations, by the working class who've been forced by the state to wage labor for capitalists through the privatization of the instruments of material creation, so that workers have to abide by the terms and conditions employers set in order to obtain a job. Jesus. The most widely agreed upon definition of state, which was formulated by the German sociologist Max Weber, is a set of institutions, alternatively one centralized institution, or groups of people with a monopoly on the utilization of force, violence, and control within a geographical territory. Think of the police, for example, a group with such claims to authorized violence in the name of that centralized institution, that administration, the government. Now, let's apply this to the capitalist class. Capitalists, private owners over the means of production, and employers of wage labor are a group of people that exclusionarily possess a set of hierarchically managed institutions, known as firms, where the law in the space they inhabit will side with them against workers in deploying police officers to force the proletariat to obey their demands. In other words, the very existence of a ruling class constitutes a state, and thus capitalism is a variant of statism. In fact, I don't believe wide-scale states could exist in our contemporary mortal coil without the existence of a ruling class, that manufactured by capitalism. This is because if the means of production are owned in common, belong to everyone who wishes to access them, this means that people won't be coerced into fulfilling certain economic occupations the state wants them to do. This includes policing, joining the military, and forcibly expelling immigrants entering into large territories. If you were to choose their jobs free to do so, the state would fall apart, since not near enough workers will maintain its authoritarian structure. Nobody on the left will call fascism left-wing. Funnily enough, though, people on the left will call anything fascist except left-wing beliefs. So the, Dinesh D'Souza types who insist fascism is on the left don't seem to understand leftism and also by extension fascism. But another thing they don't understand is that the right has historically been about the state, and this is just oblivious to them. They have historically and passionately cared about racial homogeny, identity, culture, honor, vigor, the traditional family structure, all good things by the way, the necessity of the state to compel people to act responsibly, and just in general, a kind of immaterial collectivism. To explain what separates fascism from, say, Marxism, it comes down to the differences in their collectivism in question. Because fascism is an idealist philosophy and Marxism a materialist one, the two are, of course, going to differ on pretty much everything when it arrives to the collective they're representing and campaigning for. To make matters really simple, Marxism seeks to bring heaven down to earth, to make our planet a paradise, while, on the other hand, fascism seeks the opposite, but ultimately intends at arriving at the same goal of prosperity only through alternative means. It instead asserts we need to bring earth up to heaven, so we can enter into a new realm, a spiritual state transcending the mortal realm. And this, it changes everything about the ideology's politics. There's this very great book, fantastic book, I finished reading just recently. As of writing this, it was yesterday. New Culture, New Right, by Michael O'Meara, published by Octox Media. And God, was it a good read. A lot of the book, especially at the beginning, discusses the shifting political paradigms historians have noticed occurring over the last 2 centuries or so. The old right, or the traditionalist right, referred to by the author as the true right, was the political right which sought to combat the cultural and social effects of the European Enlightenment, to manufacture a counter-Enlightenment. And these reactionary and right-revolutionary political and philosophical tendencies created. They were in opposition to liberalistic individualism, against democracy and cosmopolitanism, in favor of authority, hierarchy, and a tight social order. What you'll see from the literary work from the German conservative revolutionaries and the pre-Mussolinian fascists and the old Hegelians was this focus on religious purity, on strictness, paternalism, and national heroism. A lot of it is really beautiful, and I agree a lot with the traditionalism they sought to maintain. It was everything opposed to, now, what calls itself conservatism, this strain of right liberalism Michael O'Meara refers to as the false right. Not only is the false right opposed to individualism, despite claiming to endorse it, but it's also opposed to collectivism as well. The only individualism and collectivism which is permitted is that which exists for the bourgeois class and nobody else, not the vast majority of the world who are working class. Individualism and collectivism presented side by side often draw out a false dichotomy to imply they're inherently opposed to one another. Quite the contrary, I would argue that collectivism is an extreme expression of individualism, that in every collective one finds the multiple versions of themselves, and thus their love of themselves, through others, is strengthened, reinforced. After all, you have to know and understand yourself before you're able to know and understand anyone else. And in individualism, there exists an extreme expression of collectivism. This is because collectives are comprised of individuals, independent initially, but when cooperating together, they merge into one social cooperative body. So when an individual gets their way, ideally, the collective itself has effectively improved its health and well-being. If every individual in a collective were happy, prideful, and full of energy, then the collective, as a positive consequence, would be at its desirable height, its best, its peak. What the mainstream right is today is just a sensualist expression of liberalism, only leaning slightly to the right in comparison to social liberalism. Nothing is advocated which helps anyone, nothing is said which inspires anyone, it's just an excuse to hold on to the privileges and tyranny of the capitalist class, to continue this ongoing despotism at the expense of literally everyone, perhaps including the capitalists, seeing they still die from air pollution, and excessive profits don't lead to any noticeable increase in happiness on their part. Amazingly, these people don't recognize how the capitalist system greatly harms actual tradition.
When I was young, I used to collect baseball cards. It was my favorite hobby. And when you're a baseball card collector, you typically get as many as you can, and then you trade them with your friends. So let's say I needed a 1988 Tony Gwynn to complete my top set. My friend needed a 1988 Gary Templeton to complete his Fleer set. We would trade what we could to get the card we need, and everybody wins. Everybody gets a complete whole set. It's a win-win situation. Now the problem is that when the hobby became popular, it gathered the attention of businessmen and wealthy individuals, and they poured a lot of money into the hobby. Now the problem with this is that it commodified the industry. So instead of it being a hobby, a leisure activity that was enjoyed by people, it became a way of making money. So whereas before you would trade to make something whole, now you're looking at this baseball card, and instead of seeing a favorite player or something you need, you're seeing a dollar sign. You're asking yourself, okay, how much is this card worth? How much can I get for this card? And the important thing to realize here is how it's changing the way you conceive of this hobby, and extrapolate from that how you conceive of the world. And so what happened to the baseball card collecting industry is, while it's still around today, it basically died out because not many youth collect baseball cards anymore. It's done mostly by people who are in it for the money, people who are in the business. So you don't see a lot of it anymore. The commodification of baseball card collecting basically destroyed a once really an awesome thing to do, especially if you were young. Now, let's talk a little bit about youth sports, because that's capitalism has had a big effect on youth sports as well. It used to be that most kids in the neighborhood played something like Little League Baseball or Pop Warner, and everybody knew each other because that's what there was. It was a community event. But with the increased amount of money that's flowing into the professional sports industry, people are now conceiving of sports differently. They're looking at it differently. So now you have a lot of things called travel leagues, and these kids are joining these travel leagues. A lot of kids from the community. So what you now have is split teams. So you have a regular, let's say a Little League team. Then you have travel teams. Because parents are looking at the dollar signs in these professional leagues, and they think, well, if I put enough money into my son playing this sport, he can maybe go on to be professional and get a lot of money himself. It's coloring how people think of every little thing. We can extrapolate from that. Let's go to professional sports. Professional football, for those who don't play it, used to be an event where you gather around with family and friends once a week for a few hours. You disregard the week at work, any of the problems you had the previous week, and you concentrate just on this few hours. It was fun. It was a leisure time activity. But like everything that exists in our society now, the money comes in. It becomes commodified. So not only do people gamble on individual games, they gamble on every single little aspect of these games. The enjoyment's gone. The fun has been taken out of it for a lot of people because it's a business. People look at professional sports, especially football, and think of it as a way of making money.
Unlike universalist liberalism, I recognize that not everyone's the same. In fact, that everyone is different, very much so. Because of this, I realize that different societies need to be constructed for different groups. The variety of spaces that would be available in a national anarchist landscape would almost be endless. Every single tribe, demographic, social group would have their own permanent autonomous zone, a borderless area of land for them to develop themselves and their community spiritually, economically, and culturally. I want everyone to be able to have their ideal society just as long as it's not an infringement of the natural right to freedom of association and disassociation, thus denying others the same ability. Imperialism, for example, is clearly a denial of the each to their own system that I believe should be implemented globally. It's trespassing on territory which doesn't belong to a civilization, which was reserved exclusively for a select kind of people. Imperialism and colonialism are expressions which violate the right to individual and collective autonomy, and thus something which would inevitably backfire on the very people practicing it. What does the conservatism, on the other hand, conserve? Capitalist oppression in absence of individualism and collectivism. Just despotism and statism, nothing more. So to wrap things up, we currently inhabit the realm of almost universal liberalization. Economic and social, it is an exercise of authority which harms both those on the traditional left, such as communists, socialists, anarchists, syndicalists, and so on, and the traditional right, German conservative revolutionaries, reactionaries, fascists, National Socialists, etc. Our social landscapes have transcended the metapolitical and are instead only obsessed with furthering the oppression present today, and it leads us, those willing to break normative barriers within the political spectrum, to recognize that capitalism and ancestral cosmopolitanism are both based upon the same harmful principles, diversity and inequality. It is through the overthrow of an economic and social system, originally created by means of an overthrow, so it's an overthrow of an overthrow's cultural effects, that a new set of societies, distinct in character and essence, wholly vitalic, heroic, self-sufficient, strong, and autonomous, will emerge from revolutionary direct action.